We had several people come forward who shared stories that they had heard over the years of Ms. Gardner stating that she hated Jared and could not stand the fact that she had to share custody with him, and that she wanted him dead.
The woman accused of hiring a hitman to kill her ex-husband, a Microsoft executive, wants to be let out on bail until her murder trial. Now it's up to the judge to make a ruling, and there is a lot of evidence that was presented in court. Thomas Holt, professor at the Michigan State University School of Criminal Justice and expert in cybercrime, is here to talk about this complex case. Welcome to Sidebar, presented by Law&Crime. I'm Jesse Weber. Okay, I want to tell you a story right now. It concerns a woman named Shanna Gardner and her ex-husband, Jared Bridegan. This is a senior design manager with Microsoft, lived in the Jacksonville Beach, Florida area. They shared twins together before divorcing in 2015. Since that time, Gardner had been married to a man named Mario Fernandez Saldana, and Bridegan had married a woman named Kristen. So Gardner and Fernandez Saldana are now accused of plotting Bridegan's murder, hiring a hitman, and actually going through with it. So in February of 2022, 33-year-old Jared Bridegan had just dropped off the twins at their mother's house in Jacksonville Beach. He was on his way back to his own house with his 2-year-old from his second marriage in the back seat. I want you to remember that. And according to police, it appears that someone left a tire in the middle of the road, and when Bridegan got out to move it, he was shot multiple times at close range. His daughter was still strapped into her car seat, remained that way until police arrived. She is fine. She was uninjured. She was unharmed, but she was there. And nearly a year after the shooting, police announced a major development. They made their first arrest in January of 2023. A man named Henry Tenen admitted to police that he was the one who shot Jared Bridegan and agreed to plead guilty to second-degree murder with a weapon. Okay, as part of that plea agreement, Tenen has to testify truthfully about his involvement in the crime and his interactions. But who did he have interactions with? Did he just do this alone? Not exactly, because prosecutors are alleging that he had interactions with the second person to be arrested in this case, Mario Fernandez Saldana. So investigators found out that Fernandez Saldana was the only connection between Bridegan and Tenen. Tenen was actually a tenant at a property of Fernandez Saldana's, and Fernandez Saldana, remember, at the time of the murder, was married to Shanna Gardner, the ex of Jared Bridegan. So apparently Gardner and Bridegan were in the middle of a bitter custody dispute over their twins when Bridegan was killed.
What did he advise you about how it was that he came to be involved in Jared's murder?
Mr. Tenen was a tenant at one of their rental properties, and he had been approached by Mr. Fernandez a number of times asking him if he would participate in this homicide. Mr. Tenen stated that he initially denied Mr. Fernandez's request. However, once Mr. Fernandez had agreed that they would, being Shanna and Mario, would invest $150,000 into a pallet business, he agreed to participate.
Okay, and I want to go back and ask some follow-up questions about that. When you say that Henry Tenen said Mario Fernandez requested him to participate in a homicide, what specifically was that conversation, according to Mr. Tenen?
He stated that in exchange for the money, that Mr. Fernandez would provide a firearm, and then they would contrive a plan. Initially, the plan was to kidnap Mr. Bridegan and then take him to another location and murder him.
And did Mr. Tenen advise as to what, if anything, Mario Fernandez Saldana said about why he wanted to murder Jared Bridegan?
They had initially planned, or were planning this in late 2021, and then after returning from a Hawaii trip in February, Mr. Fernandez approached Mr. Tenen and stated that this needed to happen this week. So, and if he didn't get it done, that his marriage was going to end.
Did Henry Tenen know Jared Bridegan?
No, he did not.
Had he ever seen him before the night of the homicide on February 16, 2022?
No. In fact, there were 2 instances where Mr. Fernandez took Mr. Tenen in an attempt to show him Mr. Bridegan, and both of those were failed attempts.
given the relationship of Mr. Tenen being a tenant of Mario Fernandez Saldana and Shanna Gardner's rental company, were you able to find in your investigation any other link or connection between Henry Tenen and Jared Bridegan?
None.
In your conversations with Henry Tenen, was Mr. Tenen able to, even before this night, describe what Jared Bridegan looked like?
Not at all.
What type of car he drove?
No.
Did he know on the night that he murdered Jared Bridegan that BB would be in the vehicle with him?
He did not know that.
Fernandez Saldana was arrested in March of 2023. He was charged with first-degree murder, conspiracy to commit first-degree murder, solicitation to commit a capital felony, and child abuse because Bridegan's daughter was in the car when her father was shot. So that's how you get that extra charge there.
She made mention of hearing a loud sound, boom, boom, saying that she had to take her shoes off to cover her ears. And she made mention that her daddy was sick and was on the ground and needed a doctor.
Shanna Gardner, meanwhile, was arrested on the other side of the country out in Washington State. She was hit with the same charges. She and Fernandez Saldana being tried together, but with separate attorneys. Both face the death penalty if convicted. However, we have recently learned that Jose Baez, famed criminal defense lawyer who has represented Casey Anthony, he is representing Miss Gardner. Now, on Wednesday, the judge had a hearing to determine whether Gardner could be released on bond pending trial. And during that hearing, the prosecution argued that even if Gardner didn't physically actually shoot her ex-husband, his blood is still on her hands. She is guilty. And they laid out some of the evidence that led to Gardner's arrest. Now, before we get into anything that happened in that hearing, I want to bring in Thomas Holt, professor at the Michigan State University School of Criminal Justice, expert in cybercrime, here to talk about this complex case. Thomas, good to see you. I went to University of Michigan. I think we can still continue this interview nonetheless, but very happy to have you nonetheless.
Yes, thank you for having me.
What are your overall thoughts on this? Because one of the things that shocks me is, and I see so many of these cases before, where someone is accused or is found guilty of hiring a hitman to actually carry out a murder, you would think they want to create less of a trail back to them. And when doing that, even though you hire that middleman, you leave even a worse trail, more evidence tying back to you.
Yeah, we're at a point in time where there is evidence everywhere. Even if we're very careful, there's going to be text messages, search histories, things that will give some inkling of either a rationale for an action or a loose connection between two people that can establish some kind of culpability in an offense.
And that's what we're going to get into. But before we get into that, I just real quick, what did you make of the crime scene? So I mentioned the way that this was an attempt to lure him, to stop him. 2 rounds struck that car. It's amazing that that daughter is okay. And by the way, that daughter, so sad to think about. She apparently told police that she heard boom, boom, had to cover her ears with shoes, that her daddy was sick. I mean, it's just unthinkable. But that was the crime scene that we're talking about here.
Yeah, that's a heartbreaking story to read. And not only because of the loss of his life, but what this little girl had to experience. And it's the kind of thing that reminds me of something out of a movie almost, in terms of seeing a tire and having to stop. It's a very good lure and one that seems very cinematic.
By the way, one thing this story makes clear, and not to make light of this in any way, you need a good lawyer. I think that's pretty clear from this. And you know when that is especially true is if you get injured, if you get hurt. That is such a world-changing event. That can be so traumatic. How do you even navigate that? Well, that is why I want to take a minute to call out our great partner and sponsor here on Sidebar, Morgan & Morgan. This is a firm you would want in your corner because they are specialists in this area. Morgan & Morgan is America's largest injury law firm, and for a reason. They win a lot. They have secured multi-million-dollar verdicts and settlements. They secured a $120 million verdict in one of the first personal injury trials post-pandemic. And by the way, in that case, there was a pretrial offer of just $20,000. Yeah, Morgan & Morgan, they don't settle for lowball offers. They will fight to protect your legal rights and for what you deserve in compensation. But one of the best things about Morgan & Morgan is how easy they make this whole process for their clients. From starting your claim to uploading documents to signing contracts to talking to your legal team, it can all be done from your smartphone. That's it. Seeing if you have a case only takes a few minutes. And by the way, there's no upfront fee. No, you only pay them if you win. So if you've been injured in an accident, you can check out Morgan & Morgan. You can start a claim in 8 clicks or less without even having to leave your couch. To start your claim, visit forthepeople.com/LC Sidebar or by dialing #law. That's #529 on your phone. Now, let me go into some of the evidence. So according to the prosecution, Henry Tenen told police that he agreed to kill Jared Bridegan for $150,000, that the money was to be invested into a business in small amounts, this according to Tenen, probably as a way to make it look like it was legitimate. There were checks that were written to Tenen and his alleged business. They were pulling money from Gardner's trust. The defense countered this by pointing out that the checks were always signed by Fernandez Saldana.
I'm drawing your attention to the screen now. There's a red box. Can you describe for the court what is indicated by that on this checking statement?
The statement is indicating a deposit for $2,000 on March 28th, which would be in line with the check that's in the top right-hand corner.
And this is March 28th, 2022.
Correct.
This would be about a month and some time after the murder of Jared Bridegan.
That's correct.
And then a second red box.
Correct.
Describe what this indicates.
This is a check that was deposited on the next day, on March 29th, for $3,000, also written from First Choice Home Rentals.
Okay. And on the next slide, we see the final check and final box. Can you describe what we're seeing here?
This check was on April 6th for $5,000, written to Henry Tenen from First Choice Home Rentals.
And in the subject line, it says, Kickstarter, good luck. Can you describe for the court, based on your conversations with Mr. Tenen, what this check was actually for?
Mr. Tenen stated this was the first of many payments that was supposed to be an investment into his pallet company, which was actually payment for the homicide.
Now, the prior checks, the $3,000 and $4,000, were marked for landscaping and roofing. What did Mr. Tenen say about those payments?
He stated that those payments were for legitimate work that he'd done on the rental property on Potomac Avenue.
So this was the first and the only payment he actually received from First Choice Home Rentals for the contract killing of Jared Bridegan.
Correct.
So during your investigation, at some point, did you start hearing from people that you should be looking at Shanna Gardner and Mario Fernandez Saldana as suspects?
Almost immediately.
And how did you get information directing you to look into these individuals?
We had several people come forward who shared stories that they had heard over the years of Miss Gardner stating that she hated Jared and could not stand the fact that she had to share custody with him and that she wanted him dead.
And you heard this unsolicited from numerous people, not just one person.
Correct.
When you heard this information, did you investigate into the past history of Shanna Gardner and Jared Bridegan?
Yes, ma'am.
And they had gone through a pretty acrimonious divorce.
Correct.
And can you briefly describe for the court what that investigation uncovered for you?
They were divorced in 2015 and pretty much consistently between 2015 up until Jared's death, they were in court at least annually. Pretty much every aspect of the child custody was litigated and fought through mediation. It was to the degree that they no longer had any type of verbal communication about their children. Everything was done either in writing or through an attorney.
And from your investigation, were they even able to be in the same room together?
No,
How did they co-parent?
through the court.
When they went to the school, did they have separate parent-teacher conferences?
It was indicated that they had separate parent-teacher conferences, they would have separate doctor's appointments, or only one of them would attend the doctor's appointments. There was virtually nothing that they did together as far as their kids were concerned.
We mentioned that Gardner had this trust. She comes from apparently a wealthy family, and prosecutors showed bank statements that present that Gardner's parents were putting money into a trust for Shanna and her kids. Turns out, though, that Fernandez Saldana was the trustee. If it was Gardner's personal account or personal income, then it seems her ex-husband could have potentially have had access to it. So if Bridegan were to suddenly disappear, Gardner would get custody of the twins, have full access to a trust fund. That's the argument from the prosecution. Thomas, does that paper trail make sense to you?
Face, yes, I think that makes sense. It's one that I think will be a little harder from a defense perspective to argue, but the issue is we're dealing with people with some degree of wealth, and so trusts and this kind of management might be more common than what the average person might experience, especially if they're going through a divorce.
The fact that, as the defense countered, and by the way, I think it was confirmed by a detective, there is not a single check signed by Shanna Gardner from that account. Is that a problem for the prosecution?
Yes, it certainly could be.
But it's not the end all be all, because they had this shared relationship, she and Fernandez Saldana, right? So in other words, in cases that you've seen, you can convict somebody even if they weren't the one to physically pull the trigger, not if they were the one to even put up the money, but if they were a part of it some other way, right?
Yes, exactly. And so this is where other pieces of evidence, any kind of relational tie that can be established, will be important.
And the prosecutors allege that, and by the way I also understand it is there's no paper trail between Gardner and Tennant, the hitman. I don't think they've even met. There's no text messages. There's no phone calls. Is that common in a case like this?
Well, with what we know about hitman relationships generally, they're usually friend of friend kind of relationships where you may not know the individual, but you know someone who knows them. And so establishing that kind of connection is sensible, and it works with what we know traditionally about hitman cases.
Yeah. It's interesting because we covered another big case here, the Dan Markel murder trial, an FSU law professor. It was a hitman case, and the person who just got arrested in connection with this mother, she never presumably met the hitman that actually carried it out. So there was a little bit of disconnect as well, but that just came to my mind. But prosecutors, they have also alleged in this case that Gardner had spoken before about wanting to have her husband killed. And this is big evidence for the prosecution. There are reports that 5 years before Bridegan's death, Gardner allegedly spoke about hiring a hitman. Fernandez Saldana reportedly made statements about being able to, quote, get 4 guys to take care of Bridegan. No one would ever know. There was a text message allegedly from Gardner where she says, I would love to see him get a lethal injection. Prosecutors introduced Gardner's text messages in 2015 with a close friend where Gardner wished that Bridegan would disappear. She and the friend would also use code words. They used stupid as a nickname for Jared Bridegan and said casserole or funeral potatoes in reference, or seemingly in reference to his death. They also referenced wanting someone who could shut people up and who does permanent disappearing acts, referring to a magician. The defense said these texts are irrelevant, that they happened years before the murder. There is a long cooling off period. The detective also acknowledged that some of the comments came off as jokes. The texts like, I'm going to kill someone, the defense said, have been used in conversations before. It doesn't mean that she meant for anyone to die, because they referenced a text message where she said, or allegedly said, I need a break from my kids, like I'm ready to kill them.
You know, I don't see anything in here where Miss Gardner is asking Miss Jensen to reach out to sue. I don't know how that can be, what Ms. Jensen did can be used against Ms. Gardner at this point. Again, we're talking about things that are 6 years prior to the killing of Jared Bridegan. I don't believe there's any allegation from the state whatsoever that this led to anything, or that even in the state's theory, to the death of Mr. Bridegan. It's totally irrelevant. It is so stale, and this court should not even consider it for purposes of this bond hearing. It's not relevant.
Even as a co-conspirator statement?
Are they saying that the conspiracy went back to 2016? Is that the state's argument?
It's definitely.
The date range encompasses these text messages and the charged indictment. There are further statements leading up to the death of Jared Bridegan between these individuals. They are relevant because they show Ms. Gardner's state of mind, intent, incitement, encouragement as it relates to being a principal of first-degree murder. This is a bond hearing. The rules of evidence are loosened. There is no jury before the court. The court can give whatever weight to these text messages it deems fit based on the argument of Mr. Carodi, but his argument goes to the weight, not the admissibility. They are admissible because they are simultaneous statements to a conversation she's having with Ms. Jensen to a third party that is then referenced by Ms. Gardner and Ms. Jensen about what it is they're planning to do or hoping to see done.
How important are these text messages?
It's tricky because they're very well worded, and the length of time between when they were made and the actual death is so long that, yeah, it is hard to say that this is a direct one-to-one for the event itself. The fact that you're talking about wanting someone dead if they're in the middle of a divorce or they're having a very bad breakup, these are things that anyone might say. And the fact that the language is coded to read as something of a joke or perhaps even an inside joke between two friends, that makes it difficult. And a jury, upon hearing that, may be inclined to go with either the defense or the prosecution. It's going to be up to the individual there. So if they were more recent, then I think there might be something more compelling. It might make the evidence harder. But as it is, it's one that could be argued as quite a tenuous kind of relationship.
And Jose Baez, again representing Ms. Gardner, said that there are no texts about hiring a hitman in 2020 or 2021.
Child abuse. The principal instruction in Florida is just that she had a conscious intent the death of Jared Bridegan occur and that she did some act or said something that was intended to and did incite, cause, encourage, assist, or advise other people to carry out this homicide. And again, she had no dealings directly with Henry Tennant. There are no communications the state of Florida has, or even if we had, that we could use at trial between her and Mario Fernandez because they have stayed married to this day. What we have is a tremendous circumstantial case against her based on her words and her actions. Circumstances that she incited, because we will never have direct evidence of that unless Mario Fernandez Saldana decides to become a state cooperator. Those being that this woman is the only person in the world that had this level of resentment, hatred, and motivation to ambush, eliminate Jared Bridegan. That she wanted to have total control and freedom over the decisions in rearing their children. That she spoke at her interview with Jacksonville Beach Police about her resentment for how he was during their marriage, and some resentment for how she felt that he was acting now. As you know, now he's turned the corner. Now he's the perfect husband. Now he's the perfect father. And that freedom, that motivation is evident based on where everybody ended up. Because Henry Tennant, no doubt, pulled the trigger and killed Jared Bridegan. He's confessed to it. He says he did it. He says Mario Fernandez solicited him, paid him, provided the firearm, drove him there, was on scene when he murdered Jared Bridegan. There is no motivation for Henry Tennant to do this crime without being incited, encouraged, or assisted by Shanna Gardner and Mario Fernandez. And there is no motive for Mario Fernandez to do this without the encouragement and solicitation and permission of Shanna Gardner. The most damning evidence we have comes from Shanna Gardner's own statements to her best friend, a woman she trusts with her life, a woman she talks to 5 or 6 times a day, a woman she tells the most intimate, mundane details of her life, a woman that tagged herself, quote, Team Shanna, a woman who was dragged to grand jury, was withholding, minimizing, refusing to tell police about text messages, all because she wanted to protect her best friend. The statements that she did give the state of Florida and law enforcement, likely just the tip of the iceberg of what this woman actually knows. And she wasn't bullied, she wasn't threatened, there was no show of force as suggested in defense cross-examination that we put her in a patrol car, put a bunch of posters in front of her face and made her tell us what we wanted to hear. What she told us is in black and white in these text messages. She said it at the grand jury under oath, and she said it again. And she's going to say it on that stand at the trial. That days before Jared Bridegan was ambush targeted murder with no other suspects and no other motivation, that this woman sat across from Mario Fernandez in Hawaii and told her, if you really don't want me to do this, you need to tell me now. The evidence that she said yes is so overwhelming because the ultimate result, the consequence, speaks to the action. He would not have done this. He would not have gone to Henry Tennant, given him the gun, and done this action if she hadn't said yes. Because in the end, she got what she wanted. She and Mario Fernandez stayed married, but they went their separate ways. She got control of her trust. She got to move to Washington. She has her children. No one's interfering with her now. She's got even her current husband, ex-husband, Bridegan family, nobody's interfering with her choices regarding her children.
You heard a lot of evidence of suspicion and a lot about motive. You can read 1,000 cases, Your Honor, that all say that motive is not an element to the crime of first-degree murder. Let's talk about the text messages. These texts are in 2015 and 2016 predominantly, maybe some in 2017. The detective's like, oh yeah, this continued up to 2021 and 2022. Are you kidding me? Are you kidding me? Don't you think that the state, who has the burden here that's higher than beyond a reasonable doubt, would have hit print? They don't exist, Your Honor. They don't exist. What they show is they show dislike towards Mr. Bridegan. You have a friend venting to another friend over a very difficult co-parenting situation and a contentious divorce. And many adults in similar circumstances say the exact same thing. They're indicators of frustration, but not proof of a murder on February 16th of 2022. In retrospect, those words were clearly poor judgment, but poor judgment does not in any way equate to actual intent and does not prove misconduct in this case, which would be a first-degree murder. There is zero, and I'll talk about this, there is zero evidence that was brought before you today of any act by Miss Gardner that was done with the intent to carry out a plan or directly carry out the murder of Jared Bridegan.
I have to ask you, there's no money that can be, there's no amount that could be put on a human life, but I always am fascinated by the amount that people are paid to murder someone. And I mean, that's the allegation here. $150,000. Your take on what you've seen in terms of the amount that is exchanged or agreed upon in these murder-for-hire cases or suspected murder-for-hire cases?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's usually quite low, and there's no real good rationale for this. There's evidence to suggest that people who engage in hits may be ex-convicts, they may be living in rougher circumstances, and so any amount of money may seem palatable in order to engage in a hit, especially if you're in kind of dire straits and need money. $10,000 or $20,000 is a boon for you at the time. And so it aligns with what we know generally about how much hitmen are paid.
Well, the judge is going to take everyone's arguments under advisement. He's expected to release a written ruling about Gardner's bond in the coming days. She is looking to have bond. Obviously, prosecutors are opposing that. Real quick before I let you go, I believe that bond is not going to be something that's going to be on the table for her. What do you think?
Probably not, just given the circumstances of the case. It's something that will definitely pull at people's heartstrings, especially with the 2-year-old involved. So I think that it may be a tougher call to give her bond, but it is possible just given all the circumstances in the case. However, she probably won't.
And by the way, this hearing was almost like a mini trial where we learned a lot about the evidence. We kind of get a preview of the prosecution's case, preview of the defense's arguments. So it's fascinating to follow. Thomas Holt, thanks so much for coming on. Appreciate it.
Absolutely. Thank you.
All right, everybody, that's all we have for you right now here on Sidebar. Thank you so much for joining us. As always, please subscribe on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, wherever you get your podcasts. I'm Jesse Weber. I'll speak to you next time.